On the 18th of November 1987, two young people in love got into a van and drove south, and they were never seen alive again. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18 years old. Her boyfriend, Jay Cook, was 20. They lived near Victoria, on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, and they had been given a simple errand: take Jay's father's van down to Seattle, pick up some furnace parts for the family business, and come home. An overnight trip, a little bit of freedom, a ferry ride, a night away, and a task to do for his dad. They never arrived to pick up the parts. When they didn't come home, their families reported them missing, and within about a week, both of them had been found dead in rural Washington state, in two different counties, roughly 60 miles apart from each other. Tanya was found in a ditch off a wooded roadside, her hands bound, having been raped and shot. Jay was found 2 days later, beaten and strangled, left in the brush near a river. Two teenagers who had done nothing but run an errand for a parent, murdered by someone who, as far as anyone could ever determine, had no connection to them whatsoever. The prosecutor who eventually tried the case put it in words that capture exactly why this one has haunted two countries for decades: that the violence was as random as it was savage. If cases like this one are why you're here, the ones that stayed cold for decades until the science finally caught up, subscribe to Decades Cold and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This is exactly what we do here. For 31 years, no one knew who did it. One detective worked this case for 13 of those years, and he would later say that the man who killed them had never once come up. Not as a suspect, not as a tip, not as a name in a file. But the killer had left his DNA behind on Tanya, and investigators in 1987 had done the thing that saves case after case on this channel. They preserved it. And in 2018, a genetic genealogist took that 31-year-old genetic profile, uploaded it into a public ancestry database, and went looking not for the killer, but for his cousins. She found distant relatives who had never heard of Tanya or Jay. She built their family trees outward, and then narrowed them down, until every branch on the tree converged on one married couple, a couple who had exactly one son. And then something happened that had never happened before in the history of the world. Because when this man went to trial, it wasn't only him being judged, it was the science. This is the story of Tanya and Jay, the road trip that never ended, and the first jury in history to convict a killer who had been found through his own family tree. They were kids. That's the thing to hold on to through everything that follows. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18, Jay Cook was 20. They were a young couple from the Saanich area, near Victoria, British Columbia, the quiet, green, coastal part of Vancouver Island. They were at that precise moment in life where everything is still ahead of you and nothing has been decided yet. Jay was 20 years old, and he was the kind of son a father trusts with the van and an errand for the family business. That detail alone tells you something about him. His dad needed furnace parts from Seattle, and Jay was the one sent to go get them. A young man being handed a small responsibility because he could be counted on, and Tanya went with him. Of course she did. That's what you do when you're 18 and in love and someone offers you a road trip. You turn a chore into an adventure. An overnight trip across the border, a ferry, a strange city, a night away from your parents' house with the person you love. It's one of the most ordinary and most joyful things a young couple can do. Their families would spend the rest of their lives holding on to who these two were. Years later, in a courtroom, one of Jay's sisters would say something about the man who killed them that cuts to the bone. She said he had led an unremarkable life, and then she said that Jay and Tanya, two people who had everything to live for, would not have led unremarkable lives. That's the whole tragedy in one sentence. These were not people at the end of their story. They were at the very beginning of it. Whatever they would have become, careers, marriages, children, decades, all of it was taken on a stretch of road in Washington state by a stranger, for no reason at all. So as we go through the timeline and the forensics and the courtroom drama, keep them in mind as they actually were. On the morning of November 18, 1987, an 18-year-old girl and a 20-year-old boy, in a borrowed van, on a small adventure, doing a favor for his dad. The plan was simple. On November 18, 1987, Tanya and Jay left their homes in the Saanich area and set out for Seattle in Jay's father's van, a bronze 1977 Ford Club van, a big, distinctive vehicle that would become one of the most important objects in this case. The trip required crossing from Vancouver Island into the United States, coming down through Northwest Washington, and heading to Seattle to collect the furnace parts for the business Jay's father owned. Then they'd turn around and come home, overnight at most. They made it into Washington. And then, somewhere along the way, something went catastrophically wrong. They never picked up the furnace parts. They never came home. And what makes this stretch of the story so agonizing, even now, is that the specifics of what happened in between have never been fully established. Even after everything, after the arrest, after the trial, after the conviction, it remains unknown exactly how the killer first encountered Tanya and Jay, and precisely what unfolded in the hours before they were killed. Somewhere on the roads of Northwest Washington, on a November night, a stranger crossed paths with two young people from Canada in a bronze van. That's the part we know. The rest is a black space in the record that their families have had to live with. When they didn't return, their families did what families do. They worried, and then they panicked, and then they reported them missing. And the search that followed spanned an international border and multiple jurisdictions. Two Canadian teenagers missing somewhere in the United States, last known to be traveling in a distinctive van. For several days there were no answers, only that particular agony of not knowing. And then, 6 days after they left home, the answers began to arrive, and they were the worst possible ones. On November 24, 1987, a passerby in rural Skagit County, north of Mount Vernon, Washington, found the body of a young woman down an embankment off a country road, in the wet leaves. It was Tanya Van Cuylenborg. She was 18 years old. I'm going to state the facts of what was done to her plainly and briefly, because they matter to the case and because they establish the character of the person who did this. And then we're going to move on, because the details do not honor her. Tanya had been raped, her hands had been bound with plastic zip ties, and she had been shot in the back of the head, a manner of killing that the prosecutor would later describe as execution style. She was found partially clothed, discarded off a rural roadside like something to be gotten rid of. 2 days later, hunters found Jay Cook, roughly 60 miles away, in the brush near a bridge over the Snoqualmie River, near Monroe, in Snohomish County. He was 20 years old. He had been beaten, struck with rocks, and he had been strangled. His body had been left beneath a blue blanket. 2 victims, 2 different counties, 60 miles apart. That geography is important, and it told investigators something significant about the person they were hunting. This was someone who had moved these young people and their van across a substantial stretch of Washington state, separating them, disposing of them in different rural places. This wasn't a single moment of panic. It involved planning, movement, and time. And the difference in how they were killed, Tanya shot, Jay beaten and strangled, suggested the 2 of them were killed in separate places, at separate moments. And underneath it all was the same question that would define the case for 3 decades. Why? There was no known connection between these 2 Canadian teenagers and anyone in that part of Washington. They were passing through. They were nobody's enemy. They had no involvement in anything dangerous. They were running an errand for a father's business. As the prosecutor would put it years later, the acts of violence were as random as they were savage. And a random crime, as we've said on this channel before, is the hardest kind there is to solve, because the thread that normally leads from a victim back to a killer simply doesn't exist. But the killer left things behind, and the investigators of 1987, working a case they could not solve, did the single most important thing they could possibly have done. They collected that evidence and they preserved it. The most crucial piece was biological. The man who attacked Tanya had left his DNA on her, genetic material recovered and retained from the scene. In 1987, DNA profiling was barely emerging as a forensic tool. There was no national database to search, and the ability to derive and compare a full genetic profile was in its infancy. So that evidence, at the time, could not name anyone. It could not be run against anything meaningful. It was functionally a locked box. There was more, too. Evidence whose full significance would only become clear decades later. There was a partial palm print left on the couple's van, and there were the plastic zip ties that had been used to bind Tanya's hands. All of it was collected. All of it was kept. And that decision, the unglamorous, procedural act of bagging and storing evidence in a case that was going nowhere, is the entire reason this case was ever solved. Physical evidence doesn't decay in the way memory does. It doesn't move away, or die, or change its story. It waits, exactly as it was, for the technology to arrive. Meanwhile, the human investigation ran into the wall that random crimes always create. Detectives worked it. Leads were chased and exhausted. The case passed from investigator to investigator across the years, the way long cold cases do. One detective, James Scharf, would work this case for 13 years. More than a decade of a professional life spent on 2 Canadian kids who never made it to Seattle. And in all that time, across 3 decades of investigation by many people, the man who actually did it was never a suspect. He was never on a list. His name, Scharf later said, had never come up, not once. That is worth pausing on, because it explains why this case needed a fundamentally new kind of tool. Every traditional investigative method depends, ultimately, on the killer being somewhere in the system, on a witness list, a tip line, a suspect pool, a database. This killer was in none of those places. No amount of conventional detective work was ever going to find him, because there was nothing connecting him to Tanya and Jay except the crime itself. To catch him, investigators would eventually have to stop looking for him and start looking at his relatives. By 2018, forensic genetic genealogy had arrived. Regular viewers know the method well by now. Instead of searching a criminal database that only contains known offenders, you take the killer's DNA profile and upload it into a public genealogy database, the kind ordinary people use to trace their ancestry and find relatives. You're not looking for him. You're looking for anyone who shares enough DNA with him to be family. And then you build outward from those relatives until the branches close in on one person. The genealogist who took on this case was C.C. Moore, one of the pioneers of the technique and a name that has come up repeatedly on this channel. She took the DNA profile developed from the evidence preserved since 1987 and compared it against the public database GEDmatch, looking for partial matches, the genetic fingerprints of distant cousins, and she found them. People who had uploaded their own DNA out of curiosity about their heritage, who had no idea that their family tree contained a killer, and who had certainly never heard the names Tanya Van Cuylenborg or Jay Cook. Then came the real work, which is not glamorous and is not fast. Moore built out the family trees connecting those distant cousins, tracing lines backward to common ancestors, and then forward again through generations of births and marriages and deaths, looking for the point where the separate branches would intersect. And in this case, the tree closed with remarkable precision. The genealogical work indicated that the DNA from the crime scene must have come from a male child of a specific married couple, William and Patricia Talbot. And that couple had exactly one son. His name was William Earl Talbot II. In 1987, at the time of the murders, he had been 24 years old. He worked as a truck driver and had done construction work. And when investigators looked at where he had been living back in 1987, the detail landed like a stone. He had lived near the area where Jay Cook's body was found. He had been right there the whole time. For 31 years, this man had lived an ordinary life in Washington state, working ordinary jobs, in the very region where he had left a young man's body under a blue blanket. And in 3 decades of investigation, nobody had ever so much as written his name down. Now, the rule this channel returns to again and again: genetic genealogy is a lead, not a conviction. The family tree pointed hard and precisely at William Earl Talbot II. It did not prove he was the killer. To prove that, investigators needed Talbot's own DNA, compared directly against the profile from the 1987 crime scene, and they needed to get it without alerting him. So they did what has become the standard final move in these cases. They put him under surveillance and waited for him to leave a piece of himself behind in public. In early May of 2018, that moment came, And it came in about the most ordinary way imaginable. Talbot was working. A paper cup fell from his truck. He left it. And that discarded cup, trash, abandoned, no longer his in the eyes of the law, was collected by investigators and sent to the lab. The DNA from that paper cup was compared against the DNA the killer had left on Tanya Van Cuylenborg's body in November of 1987, and it matched. 31 years, a genetic profile that had been preserved through 3 decades of dead ends, compared against a cup a truck driver dropped on the ground on an ordinary workday, and it closed the case. William Earl Talbot II was arrested in May of 2018 and charged with aggravated murder. And after the conviction, when a lab report was unsealed, the picture got even more damning. Investigators had found additional DNA belonging to Talbot on the zip ties recovered from the crime scene, the plastic ties that had been used to bind Tanya's hands. His genetic material wasn't only on her body, it was on the restraints used against her. Combined with the partial palm print found on the couple's van, the physical evidence placed him in intimate, undeniable contact with the crime, not once, but in multiple independent ways, all of it preserved since 1987, all of it waiting for someone to finally have a name to test it against. And here is what makes this case a landmark, and why it belongs at this point in our catalog. When William Earl Talbot II went on trial in Snohomish County Superior Court in the summer of 2019, it was the first time in history that a case built on forensic genetic genealogy had gone all the way to a jury. Think about where the technique stood at that moment. The Golden State Killer arrest, which we covered in a previous episode, had happened in April of 2018 and had stunned the world. But that case ended in a plea, not a jury trial. Dozens of other arrests had followed across the country as departments raced to apply the new method to their own cold cases. But none of it had yet been tested where it ultimately counts. In a courtroom, in front of 12 ordinary people, with a defense attorney attacking it. Every prosecutor and every genealogist in the country was watching this trial, because the outcome would help determine whether the entire technique had a future in American criminal justice. Cece Moore herself testified. She said openly at the time that the industry needed a precedent-setting decision, that this was the thing so many people had been waiting for, and that it would point the direction for how law enforcement could use genetic genealogy going forward. Talbot did not testify in his own defense. His lawyers advanced an argument that the jury was asked to take seriously, that Talbot had, in fact, had sex with Tanya Van Cuylenborg, accounting for the presence of his DNA, but that he had not killed her, and had not killed Jay Cook. It was, essentially, a concession on the DNA, paired with a denial of the murders. The prosecution's response was to point at the totality of the physical evidence, and at the sheer implausibility of the scenario. Under what circumstances, prosecutors asked the jury, does this defendant end up in the back of that van for a consensual encounter with Tanya? His DNA was on her. His DNA was on the zip ties that bound her hands. His palm print was on their van. 2 young people who were traveling through, who had no connection to him, who ended up dead in 2 separate counties. The jury did not accept the defense theory. On a Friday morning in late June of 2019, after 31 years of silence, the verdict was read. Guilty on 2 counts of aggravated murder in the first degree. Talbot flinched and gasped as it was read, and was wheeled out of the courtroom. Under Washington law, there was only one possible sentence. On July 24, 2019, William Earl Talbot II was sentenced to life in prison, 2 life sentences, to be served consecutively. He had become the first person in history convicted by a jury in a case cracked by genetic genealogy. At that sentencing, the people who had waited 3 decades finally got to say something to the man who had taken Tanya and Jay from them. And what they said cuts through all the forensic history and legal precedent to the thing that actually matters. One of Jay's sisters, Laura Bonstra, spoke about the cost of Talbot's refusal to admit what he'd done. By not pleading guilty, she said, he had put a whole new generation of people through his horror, forcing the families to relive it all again, in public, in a courtroom, decades later. And then she said the plainest thing anyone could say about it. Thank God he was finally off the streets. Another of Jay's sisters, Kelly Cook, said the thing that has stayed with me most out of this entire case. She observed that Talbot had led an unremarkable life, and then she pointed out the obscenity at the heart of it, that Jay and Tanya, two young people who had everything to live for, would not have led unremarkable lives. That is the arithmetic of a random murder, laid bare. A man who did nothing of note with his 60 years took two people who were just beginning and who might have done anything at all with theirs. He got the decades. They got a roadside in November. And there is something else the families had to carry, which is worse than most people realize. Even with the conviction, even with the DNA, the full story has never been recovered. It remains unknown exactly how Talbot encountered Tanya and Jay that night, and what precisely happened in the hours before they died. He did not testify. He did not confess. He offered no account, so the families received an answer to the question of who, the most important question, but the question of what happened to my child in those final hours has never been fully answered, and now likely never will be. That is an incomplete kind of justice. It's what a lot of families in these cases actually receive, enough truth to name the person, never enough to fill the silence. The story does not end at the sentencing, and this next chapter matters, because it shows how much was riding on this one case. Talbot appealed, and his appeal did not attack the genetic genealogy, which is itself telling. Instead, his lawyers argued that his constitutional right to an impartial jury had been violated, raising an issue of juror bias in his trial. And in 2021, the Washington State Court of Appeals agreed with him. The double murder conviction of the first person ever convicted through genealogy research was overturned. Imagine being one of these families in that moment. 31 years of not knowing. A trial that forced you to sit in a courtroom and relive the worst thing that ever happened to you. A conviction. 2 life sentences. And then, 2 years later, a court sets the whole thing aside on a procedural question about the jury. For the Cook and Van Cuylenborg families, the ground moved underneath them all over again. But it was not the end. The state took the case up to the Washington Supreme Court, and in December of 2022, the state's highest court reinstated the guilty verdicts. The conviction stood. William Earl Talbot II remained convicted of the aggravated murders of Tanya Van Cuylenborg and Jay Cook, and remained sentenced to life. And in a way, that appellate journey is the final piece of what makes this case so significant. This wasn't just a conviction. It was a conviction that got stress-tested at every level of the court system and survived. The identification method held up. The physical evidence held up. The verdict held up. For everyone working in this field, and for the hundreds of cold cases that have since been solved using the same technique, that mattered enormously. The Talbot case is the legal foundation the modern era of genetic genealogy is built on. Let me put the significance of this case as directly as I can, because it's the reason it deserves a place in this catalog, alongside the Golden State Killer. In an earlier episode, we told the story of Joseph DeAngelo, the first public arrest ever made through forensic genetic genealogy in April of 2018. That case proved the method could find someone. But finding someone and convicting them are two very different things. An arrest can be undone. Charges can be dropped. A case can collapse under legal challenge. What the technique had never done, before William Talbot, was face a jury, 12 ordinary citizens, with a defense attorney doing everything possible to undermine it, and win. That's what happened in Snohomish County in June of 2019, and it's why Cece Moore, testifying in that trial, framed it the way she did. The whole industry needed a precedent, and the outcome would point the direction for the future of genetic genealogy and law enforcement. When the guilty verdict came back, and when the state Supreme Court later reinstated it, the answer was delivered. The method worked. It could survive cross-examination. It could persuade a jury. It could withstand appeal. Everything that has happened since flows from that. Genetic genealogy has now been used to identify suspects in hundreds of cases that were considered permanently hopeless, including cases we've covered on this channel, in Indiana, in Iowa, across the country. Every one of those prosecutions stands on legal ground that the Talbot case helped establish. And it cuts both ways, which is worth saying. The same technique has also been used to exonerate people wrongly convicted, freeing the innocent as well as identifying the guilty. Tanya Van Cuylenborg and Jay Cook did not choose to become a legal landmark. They were two kids running an errand. But the case built on their murders became the proving ground for the single most powerful cold case tool of our lifetime. And every family who has since gotten an answer after 30 or 40 years owes something to what was decided in that courtroom. There are a few things I want to leave you with from this case. The first is about the preservation of evidence, and it is the quiet, repeating miracle of this entire channel. In 1987, investigators in Washington state collected DNA from a murdered 18-year-old girl and zip ties and a palm print from a van in a case they had no realistic hope of solving. The technology to use most of it did not exist. They had no idea whether it would ever exist. And they collected it and stored it anyway, because that was the job. 3 decades later, every single one of those items became a nail in the coffin of the man who did it. Not one detective in 1987 got to see that happen. They just did the work correctly and handed the future a chance. If you take one thing from the 15 cases we've told on this channel, let it be that the reason these cases get solved is that someone, decades ago, did the unglamorous part right. The second is about who this killer was and how ordinary he turned out to be. William Earl Talbot II was a truck driver, a construction worker, a man living an unremarkable life within driving distance of where he'd left a body. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't in a database. He wasn't on any list. And 13 years of one detective's career never surfaced his name. The only thing that ever connected him to Tanya and Jay was the biology he left behind. And, ultimately, the relatives he could not control. Distant cousins he had probably never met, who uploaded their DNA to learn about their ancestors, and in doing so drew a map that led investigators to a single household with one son. And the last thing is Tanya and Jay themselves, 18 and 20, in love, in a borrowed van, on a November morning, doing a favor for someone's dad. They should have picked up the furnace parts, spent a night in Seattle, and driven home to Vancouver Island, and gotten on with the long, ordinary, remarkable lives they were entitled to. Instead, they became a case number, and then a landmark, and then finally, 31 years late, an answer. Their families got a name. They never got the full story, and they never got the years. But the man who took them died a convicted murderer instead of a free one. And that happened only because 2 young people left a trace of the truth behind, and the world eventually built a way to read it. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe, because the next one is already waiting.